Speaker, we recognize here today that there are many problems with our current parliamentary democracies, that there's a lack of true representation by the people, that there's a lack of efficiency, and generally, we feel that we don't really uphold what a true democracy is. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, honorable judges, and worthy opponents. The resolution that stands before us today reads, "This House believes that a parliamentary democracy requires the inclusion of a sovereign referenda to decide on important issues." Now, before we get to the three main points that we on side proposition are going to bring forth, which are the flaws of the status quo, how a sovereign referenda actually strengthens all aspects of a parliamentary democracy, and my partner Luciano is going to talk about how it creates a better system as a whole, let's get into the definition and the model. So essentially, what we're going to be proposing today is so we define this House as all parliamentary democracies. And essentially, we define a sovereign referendum as a referenda where people can directly vote on a specific issue. So let's get on to the model. So the model that we would follow is the one that occurs in Switzerland, where in order to have a sovereign referenda, 3% of the population need to sign a waiver to say that they actually want a referendum to be held in the first place. Now, if enough people sign, a referendum date will be assigned. Once a referendum occurs, if over 60% of the people agree with the resolution, then it shall go to the Supreme Court to see if it is actually going in accordance with the Constitution. If so, then it will pass and be made law. But what we really want to debate here today is the principal aspect. Why, in general, should we be allowed to directly vote on issues in a parliamentary democracy? We feel that in order to win this debate today, we have to prove to you how current-day parliamentary democracies don't actually fulfill the criteria for the very definition of democracy, which is rule by the people. So let's get on to this first point, which are the flaws of the status quo. Now, what we're going to prove to you in this point is how far removed voters actually are from participating in making important decisions, and that the parliamentary democracies that we currently see cannot truly be declared rule by the people, and therefore not a true democracy. Furthermore, what we will prove is by introducing a sovereign referenda, we make parliamentary democracies more truer to democratic principles. Not at this moment. So let's examine what a parliamentary democracy looks like. Let's look at a case study of a single-member plurality. Now, in this situation, a voter in a constituency will vote for a member of parliament that they feel best represents them. The candidate with the most votes will become one voice in anywhere between 150 and 600 other representatives. From there, the body of representatives are expected to draft policies based on their parties' and constituents' wishes. Now, the body of representatives votes on legislation on behalf of the population. From there, often a second body will revise the implications of the resolution and decide whether or not it is in the best interest of the state. Now, what I've just described to you is what a current parliamentary democracy looks like. Now, let's take a step back and really ask ourselves, is this democracy? Is this ruled by the people? What we see in this case study is that the individual voter is actually so far removed from making the decision, from being a part of the decision-making process, that we cannot truly consider this system to be ruled by the people. Yes?
Do you not agree that most individuals elect a representative because of the fact that they cannot actually put in the same time and information to commit to the policies like a representative
Thank you, ma'am. Now, what we recognize here today is that when people vote for a representative, when they vote for a member of parliament to represent their wishes are often not truly represented. Because what we see is that when a member of parliament goes to parliament, they become one voice, and anywhere between hundreds of voices. Secondly, they are loyal to their party. They must be loyal to what their party wants. So at the end of the day, what we really have to ask ourselves is, are they really representing their constituents' wishes? Are they truly doing that? And we see that they're not. We see that this is inherent because if we examine that the divided loyalties that these representatives have to their parties and to their constituents, we see that current parliamentary democracies, the member of parliament will always have to side with what their party wants and with which party we represent. So what we'd argue is that in order for this system to be truly democratic, to be a truly democratic system, what we have to do is exercise, what this member of parliament would have to do is exercise his or her will of her constituents. And we see that it is not inherent in the parliamentary system that we see currently, and therefore it is not true representation by the people. No, not at this moment, ma'am. So what does a sovereign referendum do? while a sovereign referenda bridges that gap between the people and the parliament and the decision-making process. It gives the people an opportunity to truly have their voice heard, to truly make their voice count. And we'd argue that we only have a true democracy when people can directly feel that way, when people can directly vote on important issues, because democracy is, after all, ruled by the people. So this actually leads on to my second point, which is how it strengthens all aspects of a parliamentary democracy. And essentially there are three subpoints in this point. But firstly being how it strengthens the representative aspect of democracy, which is the chief goal of democracy. Secondly, we'll talk about majority governments, and thirdly, we'll talk about minority governments, and how essentially there's a virtual stalemate within these governments, and how we cannot truly consider the system to be a true democracy. So let's go on to this first one. So how does a sovereign referenda allow greater representation by the people? Well, what we'd argue is that when people can directly vote on issues that are important to them, and they feel that they have a true voice, only then are we truly fulfilling the requirements of a democracy. In a moment now. Now let's look at two situations parliamentary democracy can be in. And I'm going to show you how in both situations parliamentary democracies fail to uphold the true values of democracy. Before we get to that, yes?
In the status quo, bills can be altered to protect minority rights. What happens to the 40% under your bill?
What we say to that is, firstly, ladies and gentlemen, in the current parliamentary democracy system, we see that it's also majoritarian in nature. So what we say is that we need to have a true, when we have a true representation, when we have a true parliamentary democracy, which is ruled by the people, we said that sacrifice needs to be made. Furthermore, what we'd say to that is, if this specific bill is is infringing on someone else's rights and freedoms, such as a minority's freedoms, then it would be rejected by the Supreme Court. So we don't see how this point stands. So now let's go on to the different types of situations that a parliamentary democracy can be in. And essentially we'll show you how they both fail to uphold democracy. Let's go on to the majority government. What we'd say is, when we have a majority government, we have a party that has the most number of seats in parliament. So if they want to pass something, anything, they can. And what we say to that is that in this situation, we see that when the majority government stops fulfilling its mandate, which is to represent the majority, the people can use a sovereign referenda to exercise their political freedom. That the people can use a sovereign referenda to help the country and to help the people and to actually truly have their voice heard. No, not at this moment. Now let's go to a minority government. And what we say is that in a minority government, you actually have a party that has no support of the people, of the majority of the people. And when you have that in a minority government, you have a virtual stalemate. You have a situation where no party can actually ever pass a bill unless another party agrees onto them, and that actually very rarely happens in a parliamentary democracy. By leading important decisions to the population, we see that this gridlock gets eliminated. And this gridlock gets eliminated with a sovereign referenda, and at the same time we have the people exercising their political will and their political freedom. So ladies and gentlemen, what did we talk to you about today? Essentially, what we identified were the problems, the flaws in the status quo, the flaws of a parliamentary system, democracies that we see today. And what we would argue, and what we showed to you today, is how a sovereign referenda actually helps them. How a sovereign referenda actually allows more representation by the people and truly fulfills what a democracy is, which is ruled by the people. And it's on those grounds that we on Side Proposition are proud to believe in this case. Thank you.
Okay, we now call for this first speaker of Team Opposition to deliver her substantive and rebuttal.
Thank you. We just heard from a Side Proposition who proposed a model for us in which we had no regulation to actually decide what issues are acceptable for the people to vote on and what issues are not. We've heard from a Side Proposition who wouldn't regulate this to the extent that the neo-Nazi party in Greece that has 6% of the popular vote would be able to put their views on the international stage and would be able to institute their beliefs in this way. So in my speech today, I'm first going to go through some refutation about what we've heard from Side Proposition, and then I'm going to go into my first two constructive points for our case, that of qualifications and choices of the majority, and my honorable colleague will be talking to you about our third and final argument. So first I want to start by attacking the model we heard from Side Proposition today. Like I've already stated, we think that it's a huge problem that we haven't actually heard a definition of important issues. We think that it's a problem that there's no way to regulate what people can actually bring to the international stage. We also think that with anything, such as economics or foreign affairs, people have a lack of knowledge about these things to vote on, whereas politicians have the expertise because they dedicate their careers to this, which is what I'm going to talk about in my constructive address. But we also think that there's no accountability to the people. They can't think about the long-term effects, and if they don't think about the long-term effects, there's no way to hold the people accountable. In the case of politicians, you can hold politicians accountable by voting them out in the next election, but you can't vote out society. So we think that because there's no accountability in this sense, that it's wrong for the people to have this power. But we also ask the question, how much power do people really get when what they actually rule can be overturned by the Supreme Court, right? So I showed you the problem with giving people too much power, but even if side proposition was right on this sense, they're not even actually going to change very much by having this be overruled, because then what we're going to have is the problem of a protesting majority, right? If the majority decides that this is right, we think that it's going to be very hard for the government to regulate it. We think it's going to be very hard for the government to reject it when it's not right for the country as a whole, which we think is why we really need to have this situation of accountability, which we can only attain through party politics or through other means such as these. So what else do we hear from side proposition today outside of the model? Well, we heard the point about how people aren't truly represented by parties or by representatives, and that therefore current systems such as first past the post or such as PR aren't upholding the democracy. But I've already told you how representatives have the qualifications so they can actually weigh the wishes of the citizens to decide if it's right for all of their citizens and not just the percentage that are voting. And we also think that in this sense, it just comes back to that of accountability, right? We think that another part of democracy is being able to hold your representatives accountable. And another part of democracy is being able to have debate, is being able to have discourse. And that's something that's eliminated through a sovereign referenda because individuals and citizens aren't able to decide if a bill is right, it's just a yes or no.
Oh, because you're talking about expertise, but wouldn't you agree that member of parliaments are just common citizens like you or me, that they're not going to have as much knowledge, for example, as a master's degree in economics?
No, because there's different branches in government to specialize in certain things, which I'm going to talk about in my constructive address, but that's also kind of saying a doctor is just a citizen like you and me. Don't you think they might not totally know a medical thing? Politicians, that is their job. They know about politics, and if they don't, then you vote them out and you hold them accountable. That's not what you can do for the people. So now I'd like to get into my first constructive argument, that of qualifications, and into my first subpoint, that of expertise. You need certain qualifications in order to make the best decision for a nation. We think that people make decisions based on first impressions. For example, Obama won 97% of the black vote, and we think that people base decisions on things that aren't necessarily about policy, right? That aren't necessarily about what they're supposed to be focusing on, whereas politicians can do this. We think that people focus on political scandals instead of on actual policies at hand. So we think that we need to have representatives where this is their job, representatives who can focus on policies, whereas just scandals are based on their first impressions. There's a reason why a politician is called a politician, and it's because it's their job. They're required to have this expertise. And to get better expertise, there's different branches of government, like I stated in response to a POI, that focus on different issues. For example, we think that with the Greek economy on the brink of collapse, it's doubtful that the Greek people would have wanted the 62.47% of voters, which declined from 74% in 2000, to control such an important issue, right? Because in this sense, not only were not very many people being represented because of low voter turnout, but they didn't have the economic expertise to make such a tough decision about the country. We think that in order for people to make an educated decision about Obamacare, for example, you'd have to be able to read 1,400 pages of Obamacare. That's not the job of the citizens. Citizens shouldn't be required to do this. They don't have the time. That's why we need to allot it to people who this is actually their profession. We think that it takes a certain level of knowledge, right? In Switzerland, for example, we think that 51.72% of people realize this and simply just decide not to vote. If people don't want to take the initiative to actually vote for people to make these decisions for them, why are they going to want to take the initiative to make the decisions themselves? We think that in some cases even, referenda has led to fiscal irresponsibility, which people can't be held accountable for. And an example of this is when whether or not people should bail out Iceland was put to a referendum, right? We think that essentially people weren't able to take in the long-term effects of whether or not this would be good, and in that sense we needed the people with economic power, we needed the people with economic expertise to do this. So now I want to talk about the quality of representation, which is my second subpoint in this argument. We think that it's harder for minorities to voice an opinion under this bill. We think that like politicians are chosen by the people and they must live up to standards if they want to keep their job. We think that representation is improved in this sense because citizens have a say in who makes the choice. And even if important issues like to a minority, they're more likely to be heard in a controlled system, right? Like in a parliament, instead of just like trying to get their news out to the entire nation. We think it's easier for minorities to be represented in this controlled atmosphere. We think that because less people like are represented like by a variety, or like because there's like less people representing a variety of people, debate and discourse and discussion are going to like be more beneficial in this sense, whereas they're eliminated in a referenda because you simply have to vote yes or no. So into my second constructive point today, that of choices of the majority. We think that even if like a majority makes a choice, it doesn't mean it's best for the right of the country because, like I said, minorities can't have a say. And a good example of this was when they put when there was a referendum in Switzerland about minarets. And they ban minarets, even though that's wrong for even though that's like wrong for the religion, even though like we don't think that's fair for the minority, but they weren't able to have their voice heard, and they didn't have a representative to say that that's wrong. So just because a majority decides something doesn't necessarily mean it's right. We think that it's dangerous to leave the rights of the minority in the hands of the majority when the majority has no reason to consider the benefits of anything other than to themselves. And we also think that like party politics allow for like parties to debate, right? Especially when they're outnumbered. We think that like when debate, and like not just discussion and debate, but like we think that debating is more than a discussion, right? It's more than just like having your voice heard, because in parliament, in party politics, you can actually make changes. You can actually make compromise. We think that another goal of a democracy is to facilitate change, and is to facilitate negotiations. Like when making a bill, you can actually make changes to a specific bill when you realize it isn't working out. And that's not something you can do through referenda. So we think that in doing so, politicians can pick what's best for all, and if they need to reform something, they're able to do so. So because we don't think that people are qualified and don't make decisions like based on the interest of an entire nation, we beg to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we will now call for the second speaker, Team Proposition, to deliver the substantive rebuttal and refutation.
Assert, assert, assert. That might as well have been the case line of side negative today. Ladies and gentlemen, we believe that they have just told us that people are dumb. We believe, ladies and gentlemen, that they have just told us that governmental representatives are always perfect. But ladies and gentlemen, that's the world that side negative lives in. We, on the side affirmative, are proposing this resolution because of the fact that we live in a different world, ladies and gentlemen. A world where our right to have a say, ladies and gentlemen, is limited. We live in a world, ladies and gentlemen, that isn't oh so perfect. And that's essentially why we are introducing referendums, ladies and gentlemen. And how am I really going to justify this to you within my speech as second speaker? Well, I'm really going to talk to you about how it's going to really make a better governmental system. But before I do that, let's essentially look at what side negative has told us thus far. Firstly, they told us about the qualifications, and secondly, they told us about the choices of majority. Now let's go on to this first idea that they brought forth, which was this idea about qualifications. And they really talked about two things under this. Firstly, about accountability, and second, about knowledge. Let's go into this first idea about accountability. Now, what we would say, ladies and gentlemen, is that these people are just as accountable in their choices because these choices directly affect them, ladies and gentlemen. They're the ones who will get affected, not like, and these politicians, the choice that they make will affect others, so they aren't just as accountable as the people would be when they make their choices. Because, as we know, ladies and gentlemen, people have self-interest, and because of that self-interest, they will make choices that help them. Now let's go on to the second subject they brought up, which is this idea about knowledge. And ladies and gentlemen, what we would say is that people aren't exactly blanket dumb, like side negative has just brought forth, ladies and gentlemen. Look at the Quebec separation referendum. What essentially happened is Quebec proposed a referendum that maybe we should separate from Canada, but people were smart. People knew that it would be economic suicide, and what they did, ladies and gentlemen, is they said no. They said, let's stay with Canada, and we see, oh, it's a pretty good choice so far. Now let's go on to this second point that they brought up, because we believe that we have thoroughly addressed this point, which is this idea about how the majority choices can affect the minority. Now, what they essentially talked about within this entire point is about how minorities have absolutely no say, ladies and gentlemen. But what we say is that there's no set group of minority right now, ladies and gentlemen, that votes for exactly the same thing, and a set group of majority that votes for the exact same thing. Sometimes the referendums will go on their way, and also we believe that they can vote. And if this is going to hurt the minority harshly, ladies and gentlemen, we believe that the Constitution would thoroughly disagree with this bill, ladies and gentlemen. So those are essentially reasons why their entire case has fallen. Now let's go on to this one rebuttal that they had on our point, which is this idea about flaws of status quo, when we actually had 2 points, flaws of the status quo and also of this idea about majority and minority governance, which they completely ignored. Let's go on to this first rebuttal that they made, which is this idea about qualifications, ladies and gentlemen, about the flaws of status quo. And essentially all they talked about is that how representatives are smart, so we should make it so that they're the only ones that have the say, that we can revoke the entire right to speech because they will make the good decision. Now, what we said, and I've already talked about, is that actually, what is the truth, ladies and gentlemen? These people are actually, and these politicians are actually regular citizens. And moving on, ladies and gentlemen, the quote of democracy is based on power to the people, ladies and gentlemen. What Side Negative has told us so far is a vision of a democracy, ladies and gentlemen, a totalitarian regime. What they have told us is that if one person can make the right decision, they should be the only one making the decision, because they will always be right. And that's not what we see is right, ladies and gentlemen. Now, before I go into my constructive speech, let's essentially see why Side Negative is standing up. Yes.
The issue with having a representative is with having the people make a choice in referenda, is if a representative makes a mistake, we can get rid of him. What happens like when the people of Iceland make a mistake and put their country into debt?
What we would say, ladies and gentlemen, is that, again, that's a major flaw of a democracy that you just can't revoke. Power to the people is exactly one of the, and that's something you can't avoid, ladies and gentlemen. If the people want this decision, then let them do this decision. Now, let's move on to this next idea, which is this idea about a better system. Now, there's essentially 2 ways a referendum will make a better system. Firstly, this idea about insight, and secondly, about social discussions. Now, let's go on to this first point, which is this idea about insights. Now, currently, democracies are expected to make bills without knowing absolutely what the public is interested in or wants, ladies and gentlemen. There's barely any polls, ladies and gentlemen. What the governments and the representatives do is they make beliefs based off of their logic, based off of their decisions. There's no absolute sense of insight, ladies and gentlemen. And even if the referendum succeeds or fails, ladies and gentlemen, what essentially happens is it gives politicians kind of a sample, a taste of what the people really want, of really what the people are engaged with, ladies and gentlemen. And that really results in a government that understands their people, about politicians that can make decisions mirrored off their people, and that results in a more efficient democracy and a better democracy that runs more on the principle of power to the people, ladies and gentlemen. Now, let's look at this prime example of President Nixon and the Vietnam War. What he essentially did is he thought the people wanted to go into Vietnam and make it so that they would totally get rid of the Communist Party within Vietnam. But ladies and gentlemen, what happened is they spent many years there, and unknowingly, the people didn't want to go there. And when the people said, we don't want to be in Vietnam, he instantly made it so they went out. But in the decision he made in the first place, ladies and gentlemen, cost so much. And he made this decision because he did not know that the people didn't want to go, he thought that the people wanted to go to Vietnam. So insight would have really showed him that the people did not want to go into Vietnam, and he wouldn't have wasted so much money, and many American lives wouldn't have been lost, ladies and gentlemen. Now let's go on to the second idea about social discussions, because we believe that it is a major fallacy within the current status quo that governments decide on these issues that surround people and their social things. Ladies and gentlemen, Gentlemen, we believe this for two reasons. Firstly, that people know things about social problems that the government doesn't, and also the government simply dances around these bills like gay rights, like lots of these things that are social problems, because they don't know what the people want, ladies and gentlemen. They are afraid that if they make the wrong decision, then they can actually they could lose popularity, and that could result in the people not re-electing them. So they really dance around these issues, ladies and gentlemen. And the way these things are really being voted on, such as gay rights, are through referendums, ladies and gentlemen. These are the things that really make it so that the government knows what the people want, so they can make laws on these social problems that we face today, and they must be addressed immediately. So for those two reasons, we believe that this creates a better system. And ladies and gentlemen, the crucial question today is, do we want to make it so we live up to the real standards of democracy, power to the people? Or do we want to stand up saying, oh, people aren't educated. Oh, the government is the only one that knows. But ladies and gentlemen, we on Side Affirmative say, no, there's a different story out there. Thank you.
We told you that representative democracy is finding someone who's very much engaged in the political system, that has a very good idea of the issues that they're voting upon, and having that person who you agree with represent you on the national stage. They told you that what representative democracy is coming up with all these decisions on your own, by signing petitions, by voting on referenda, on things that we don't think you will necessarily know anything about. I'm going to go into some building and rebuttal, and then I'll go into my point of accountability. But I think we have to start right off and take a look at what they've told you about the arguments that we've made today. Now, my partner made two arguments. She firstly talked about qualifications, and then she talked to you about choices of the minority, of the majority, sorry. So for the issue of qualifications, what they told us is that there is an incentive in place to make sure that these individuals voting on a referenda make the correct decision, and that in fact this is going to represent, or this is going to have repercussions on them if they make the wrong decision. We would say that there isn't an individual in society who will consciously try to make the wrong decision, that will consciously try to make their society a worse one. But instead, we don't think that they necessarily have the ability to understand this. We can't expect the average American to vote on the Affordable Care Act because we can't expect them to read all 1,600 pages of it. That's not their job. And I would say it was interesting, we didn't actually hear in the model where these bills would necessarily come from. So could I write a 1,600-page bill? You know, it could sound pretty good in premise, and then I could just slip in whatever I want, because I doubt that more than 40% of people would actually read the whole thing in full. I don't know, but if there was anything hidden on page 1,559, I don't expect the average person to really catch on to that, right? Then they brought up the example of the referendum in Quebec regarding separatism, and what we would say in this case is that this isn't really anything. This isn't really what proves anything. What we would say is that the Bloc Québécois never reached any sort of success because they were a minority in that area. We'd say that the issue of a referenda isn't something that was going to ever give them the amount of power that they needed. That referenda taking place is something that we think harms society, but that, yeah, I'll take your POI.
Okay, sir, as a general note, if you're saying that the government is God and that they know everything that the citizens want, then how are you upholding democracy, rule by the people? How are you upholding that when you're not allowing citizens to vote directly on issues?
Okay, you've got you've got this stuff here. It mostly regards to the constructive that we've just heard. So I will get to that later, because there's stuff like, how does the government know what people want? Seems pretty simple. I'll get to that later. So the second point that we brought to you was the idea of the choices of the majority. A lot of this went really untouched. What they didn't really tell us about is like, it's interesting that debaters didn't really have a strong voice on this, but why debate is actually something that's important for a bill. Why it's not good to have some sort of compromise, because if you have a bill that's 60% to 40% and this bill goes to law, you haven't had any sort of compromise. That's something that is actually really good in a minority government. They didn't tell us why. They brought up the example of Switzerland as a sort of system of referenda that they would like, but they haven't really come out and told you if they think it's justified that minarets are something that were banned just because this majority was able to do whatever they want without having really sense talked into them. Now, what did we hear from Side Proposition in their first speech? They told you about representation. We told you that what representation truly is, and the accountability that can be had here, is voting these representatives out of power if they don't do what people want. Again, there's more about that later. Then, they told you about this idea of strengthening democracy. Again, that seems very similar to the second point. The third point. The second point is called strengthening democracy. The third point is basically called making democracy better. A very similar concept. What I would say is that how are you not more empowered, power to the people, if you actually have someone who's like a lawyer who's defending your opinions instead of just you going out on your own, making your own decisions? Like, why does someone like a lawyer do this? Why do you have someone who defend your ideas? Because they're better able to do that than you. They're better able to say, make decisions on the minutiae of economic policy. We don't think that's power to the people. We think that's confusing the heck out of them. Now, the third point that we have, this idea of a better system. They told you how the interests are not necessarily aligned between the party and the individual. We'd say that's something that's not true. They brought up the example of Nixon in Vietnam. We'd say when that war started, we think that was something that was supported. The Cold War was something that had a lot of support behind it in pretty much every way. And what we would say is that that was a conflict that was one that was regarded as very poor for the American people when they really got nothing done. And what happened in this case? What did Richard Nixon do when the people turned? He listened to the people and he left Vietnam. This is actually a wonderful example that we hadn't thought of, but we think it works wonderfully for us, that we didn't need a referendum to get out of Vietnam, that our individuals did themselves. There's something called public opinion polls. They're actually used quite a bit by politicians. Why did President Barack Obama come out on support of gay marriage? Come out, not the best term there. Anyway, why did he do that? Because he saw that in public opinion polls, that's something that had significant enough support. We have views of his from like 2000 where he was never really against that idea, but we definitely saw fear for him to bring it up because it wasn't something widely supported. Politicians listen to the people. We've only seen assert as to why that would be so. Now, the point that we have of accountability. This breaks down two ways. Firstly, into domestic repercussions. Secondly, into international repercussions. Now, we would say the incentive exists for the individual to make a good decision on a referenda, but we don't think the repercussions come along with it. You get voted out when you make a bad decision in favor for your country, but you can't remove the people from the state of referenda. You can't tell them that they've done a horrible job because this is something that's permanently instilled in democracy. That seems like something pretty simple. And we don't think that's fully appropriate when you don't have that sort of check and balance in place. That's where democracy becomes something that is truly valuable, because no matter if you have a minority or a majority, you have an ability to change the overall political landscape in a way that basically you think suits society in a better way. Sure.
So you're talking about checks. What's the check on a majority government? How do we get rid of the stalemate in a minority government? Your side opposition still hasn't responded to any of that.
Okay, I'll do it right now. I have a minute. What we would say is that a minority government is something that doesn't need a sort of check and balance because it is in itself a check and balance. You have the leading party in power, and then to actually have them get a bill through, they have to have the support of other parties. That means they're going to have to make compromise. We think that that's something that's protected time by quite a while. We think that that's something that truly gets more people satisfied with a bill that goes in place. We think that that's something that's really positive. Okay, now on to the issue of international repercussions. We think that individuals from a society are not going to be able to go out on an international scene and support the decisions that they made, but we still have people that have to do that. Our head of state or ambassadors have to defend domestic policy across the world, and we don't think that that's We think that that's something that trivializes their position. When they can't make guarantees to a person from another country as to what they were going to do because they don't know if that's going to get past a referenda, we think that that's something that gives them quite a lot less value in dealing with foreign policy. Because we don't think that this is something that's ever going to really suit a country properly, because we think there's such things as public opinion polls and that, in fact, representatives do have aligned interests with the people, we believe this bill must fall. Thanks.
Okay. Ending constructive speeches on side proposition, we call for the third speaker.
Side opposition today wants to preserve democracy. But our current parliamentary democracies have become less valuable, Mr. Speaker. But the input of the people, Mr. Speaker, is paramount, and we argue that more of the input of the people will create a more valuable democracy, a more valuable parliamentary democracy. So basically, this debate is really boiled down to three key themes. Firstly, knowledge. Secondly, better representation. And thirdly, government. And we argue, Mr. Speaker, that through the use of these three themes, I'll prove to you why the debate is falling on the side proposition thus far. So firstly, into this idea of knowledge. So, Mr. Speaker, side opposition brought forward this idea that people have a lack of knowledge and that politicians are better trained for to do these decisions. But we oppose this on multiple bases. Firstly, Mr. Speaker, politicians don't always do the right thing. We use this example of block voting, Mr. Speaker, that politicians are influenced by their party and that politicians will vote with their party's ideals, not necessarily the will of the people. Mr. Speaker, we question, Mr. Speaker, where is the representation here? Where is democracy, which is supposed to be the will of the people? We don't see that through block voting, and this actually lay unrebutted to buy side opposition today. No, thank you. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, about democracy. And we argue that democracy, Mr. Speaker, isn't the will of the politicians, but it's the will of the people. And according to democratic values, Mr. Speaker, if democracy is truly the will of the people, then these uneducated people who, according to side opposition, aren't educated to make the decisions should still be allowed to participate in our government, because democracy is the will of the people, not democracy isn't the will of the smart people, the will of the educated people, nor the will of the politicians. It is simply the will of the people. Thirdly, Mr. Speaker, we argue that politicians need society's input in many cases. We can use the example in Kitchener-Waterloo, where a proposal was made to build more train tracks so that people could use more public transportation. Now, some politicians argued this was simply good because people would stop using cars. However, Mr. Speaker, some politicians argued that this would be bad, this was a waste of money, the people weren't going to do it. What was needed here, Mr. Speaker? The society's input was needed here. Was society willing to use more public transportation if it was made available? I'll take you in a moment. And we argue, Mr. Speaker, that society's input was needed here, and a referendum was actually held, and the proposal was proposed because more people were willing to use public transportation. Yes.
The logic in this argument is the only current flaw is that the people's input wasn't there. Why can a simple poll not do what you're suggesting?
We argue, Mr. Speaker, that referenda is actually a much more effective way to do so. We argue, Mr. Speaker, that firstly we see an inherent similarity between a poll and a referenda. We argue, Mr. Speaker, that simply a referenda is we argue that referenda is just a better way to do this. We argue referenda is a better way to bring forth a more parliamentary democracy. Now I'll move on to my second theme today about better representation. Well, thank you. We argue, Mr. Speaker, that firstly side opposition brought forward this idea of bringing forth simply a 1,600-page bill and having something hidden in between. Firstly, Mr. Speaker, our model specifically stated that 3% of the population must want the bill to go forward, and Mr. Speaker, we argue that no 3% of the population is simply going to want a 1,600 bill to go forward that they haven't read, so again, on that basis, that point falls. Secondly, they argue about, no thank you, how politicians better represent the people, and they use the example of you use a lawyer to represent you, I quote, you don't represent yourself. Well, Mr. Speaker, we argue that a lawyer has no bias and that politicians are influenced by their parties through block voting, and we argue that on that basis, that point falls as well, yes.
The value of a public opinion poll is that people's opinions change. Why would you take those polls and make them permanent?
We argue, Mr. Speaker, that simply referenda actually does comply with changing views. It's not that a referenda not that a referenda at a certain time represents the will of the people. We argue, Mr. Speaker, that firstly the will of the people is not going to change so drastically. It's not going to change over simply a short period of time, and we can see this through many cases. We argue that that point falls. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, we argue that in a way referenda does comply with changing views, and that simply our current government does not also comply with changing views. We argue that our current government, Mr. Speaker, simply caters to a majority, not necessarily the minority, and our current government does not really comply with changing views at all. Thank you. So then we also argue, Mr. Speaker, that government won't bring up issues that they don't want. For example, we brought forward this idea of, we argue that government won't bring up issues that they don't want, such as gay marriages. Now, Mr. Speaker, we argue that citizens should bring this up. We argue that citizens are better equipped for social issues. We argue, Mr. Speaker, that currently in our parliamentary democracies, governments aren't going to bring up these issues that they don't want, for example, gay marriages. No, thank you. And we argue that citizens that want these issues to bring up, referenda is the best way to do so. So, also, we move on to my third theme today about government adjustment. So, Mr. Speaker, they argue that you can't vote society out, but you can vote politicians out. Mr. Speaker, we argue that we don't want society to be voted out, because society's input is all that is needed in a democracy, and a democracy that is the will of the people. We argue society's input, Mr. Speaker, does not really want to be voted out, and we argue that society's input supersedes politicians' input. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, we argue that currently that doesn't really stand about wanting to vote society out, because we don't want to vote society's input out. Secondly, we argue that if the majority is going to support something, it's hard for the government to regulate. Again, we argue, why does the government need to regulate this if it is the will of the majority? The government shouldn't be using authoritarian rule to use it to supersede the will of the majority. Thank you. They also try to argue this idea of rule of the people harming government, and they use a bunch of examples here, like the Iceland example, the Switzerland example. However, Mr. Speaker, what we argue is that the will of the people is paramount, that if the people make mistakes, it's simply okay. Because in accordance to democratic values, people should be able to make mistakes. That if it's the will of the people, and the will of the people is in essence a mistake, we argue that, Mr. Speaker, on that basis it should be allowed to do so. Also, Mr. Speaker, it's not that the government doesn't make mistakes. Most of the euro crisis is due to governmental mistakes. We argue, Mr. Speaker, that actually government makes mistakes as well. So on that basis, we don't see how that stands. Yes.
If a government is opposed to something that's chosen through a referenda, wouldn't they still just ban it because they can regulate that anyway?
Could you please repeat the paper?
Because under your model, a government can refuse passing a bill even if it was chosen by the majority. Does that even give them, give the people any more representation?
Mr. Speaker, we argue that firstly, the government cannot put down a bill. The Supreme Court can put down a bill if it goes against Constitution. We argue, Mr. Speaker, that referenda that goes against Constitution simply should not be placed. And we argue, Mr. Speaker, that kind of takes away all these points about how people will make, the people that make detrimental mistakes to minorities, or that also the example about Switzerland about it was against religious freedom, that, Mr. Speaker, would have been put down by Supreme Court under our model. Finally, they brought forward examples where citizens have done bad. They brought forward examples where, citizens, Mr. Speaker, have done all these things that have been detrimental to the government, like, for example, that Iceland example. However, Mr. Speaker, I have an example, but Mr. Speaker, we argue that, we can bring forward examples where citizens have done bad, but we argue that, I'll bring forward an example where citizens have done good. There was a referendum to help the Swiss citizens during the first oil price crisis, where Switzerland suffered from very high unemployment. At that time, Mr. Speaker, Swiss government created a mandatory unemployment insurance. They believed that this was best for the people. However, Mr. Speaker, the people actually thought differently, and through a referendum, we argue that the Switzerland people, through a referendum, Switzerland people actually started a social welfare program, and we argue that that helped the people much more than actually simply what the government wanted. We argue that society's input here helped themselves, and we argue on that basis, Mr. Speaker, that's where it did good for society. So we argue that sure, there are examples where it's done bad, examples where it's done good, but in order to preserve democratic values, we argue, Mr. Speaker, that we need to promote referenda. And on that basis, we beg to propose.
now call for the last constructive speaker of this match. Third speaker on.
The only problem side proposition is trying to solve is the fact that governments don't know what their people want. That is the issue outlined by side's proposition. We have very effectively dealt with that issue without the harms of referendum. They never could tell you why a poll cannot actually do the same thing as a referendum. In fact, they conceded that they are the same thing, except for one is permanent and one is not. But moreover, the third speaker just told us, and he just conceded, that the outcomes of a referendum aren't better than the outcomes of a parliamentary democracy. He said it only matters because rights are being upheld. In that one assertion, we see that that side just conceded the entire practical case. The only thing left standing for them is the fact that people aren't heard, and as the second speaker said, we're currently living in like some tyrannical regime where the people are oppressed and they can't get their voice out. What I'm going to do in the next 8 minutes is I'm going to show you through the three themes of clash, that being, are voters represented, what are the effects on the government, and finally, who is more qualified, why side opposition has clearly taken today's debate. So let's look at this first idea of, are voters represented? So through somewhat of a civics lesson from the first speaker, we were told basically how a parliamentary democracy works, and told because there are so many steps between when you elect your representative and when a bill goes through, that means you aren't being heard. They never told you, ladies and gentlemen, and this is why we fundamentally disagree with the problem that they've outlined. We don't think there is this need, because they never told you why your representative would not want to represent you. They never told you why that individual would actually try to not bring up your ideas. Now, I know all three POIs right now are about party politics, so I'm going to reply to that right now. No, thank you. Basically, their only reply to this was the idea that party politics influence politicians to vote with their party. What we would say on side opposition is that oftentimes you are voting in an individual who is a part of a party whose views you agree to. We don't believe that an individual is going to be voting in a conservative when they have liberal views. We would say that the individual's views are also in line with the party. We don't see this as a problem. No, thank you. What we tell you is that there's no incentive for these representatives to actually not follow through with what they promised in elections. The reason for this is because their incentives of re-election are aligned with the popular opinion of the people. If individuals are being ignored, if there was this tyrannical oppression that the second speaker went on about, then we would see them being voted out. That is not the status quo. We have checks and balances in the current system. They never addressed that. Moreover, we talked to this idea about how minorities are not represented. We gave you the example of Minarett in Switzerland. Their only reply to this argument was, well, our model protects things like what happened in Switzerland that wouldn't happen. Funny, I could have sworn your model was based off of Switzerland. What we see is that even the model that they have projected in real life has tangible harms. The response to these tangible harms were, it's okay, people make mistakes. We don't think it's okay when people make mistakes. I'll get into that when it's on such big tangible issues under who's more qualified. No, thank you. They brought up the example of Nixon in Vietnam. Oliver aptly pointed out how that fell on our side, how that showed how there was support for opinion, but even if Nixon changed his ideas when support went the other way without a referendum, we never heard that example resubstantiated. That falls on our house, even though it was supposed to help them. In POIs, we told you that a poll and referenda are based on the knowledge we get from a poll can do the same thing and solve the issue they're talking about. The reply was, yes, they're similar, but referendum is better. They never told you why it was better. In fact, we would like to argue on side opposition that it's worse, because as Oliver pointed out in the POI, polls are subject to change in public opinion. We think that when side proposition replied by saying, well, referendums can change with public opinion too, we think that creates a lot of practicality issues. When we're now allowing individuals to change the law just because their opinion changes every 10 seconds, right? We think that that's a huge issue. They never dealt with the model attack that Bree brought up about the fact that now the neo-Nazi party can propose bills, or the idea of who's writing these bills. Can I write a bill? They never told you any responses to the model attack. Maybe the reply can do it. I don't really know. So moving on to the second effect on government. They brought up one argument which we've thoroughly refuted, but they've said we haven't. So here I'm going to do it again and in a new way, just for fun. So they told you basically that this helps majority governments and minority governments. They told you it helps majorities because now people can veto tyrannical governments if they don't do what the people want, and they told you it will help a minority because there's a stalemate. So first let's deal with the majority. First, they will believe that there isn't going to be this majority government who's putting in a bill that most of the people don't want. Why is that? We thought it was self-explanatory, but let's explain that now. A majority government is not going to put through a bill that majority of the people in the country do not want because they won't get re-elected. No one is going to vote them in again if they're doing things that the people don't want. That is how democracy works. Moreover, we think that even if the voter does, first of all, we think that they want to vote for the people, but even if they don't do what the people want, they will get voted out. So there is the repercussion. One moment, please. We think with the minority, it's not going to help the stalemate because of the fact that it doesn't actually do anything to further debate. We're not actually helping the ideas within Parliament. There's still going to be that conflict between the two of them. Yes.
Ma'am, if you believe so passionately that governments want to be re-elected so they make such good bills, then why do governments still make bad bills even if they want to be re-elected?
Okay, we don't think any government makes bad bills on purpose. What happens is we think that those governments that do make bad bills, if they're so bad or so horrible for the people, they won't be re-elected. We clearly see that no bill will be perfect. We conceded that. We never said politicians are perfect or the government is God, as one of the POIs said. We recognize there are harms with them, but as I get into more who's qualified, we'll see how the repercussions for those errors are different. No, thank you. They never replied and still haven't replied to Gree's argument about party politics and about how compromises in bills are an important thing, about how being able to protect minorities is also an important thing. But they also never responded to this idea about how debate occurs when you have bills in Parliament, and with a referendum, it's yes or no, and pretty much effectively ends debate. We never heard a reply. Moreover, we see that this actually doesn't work within countries. Why does this not work? It falls into the idea of party politics that Bree brought up. You cannot vote for a conservative for an economic bill and a liberal for social programs. Why doesn't that work, ladies and gentlemen? Because you need a cohesive policy in order for a government and a country to function. I cannot vote on tax cuts, but also say I want free daycare for all children. Because these two things aren't compatible, it is very important for countries to have united and cohesive policies. Their bill actually makes this far, far worse. They never replied to Oliver's argument about international repercussions, about how in terms of foreign policy, it makes it very difficult for governments to defend it if they don't necessarily believe in it. We still haven't heard a reply to a lot of content, and we've thoroughly dealt with theirs. Now let's move on to the last theme of who is more qualified. I've dealt with this a bit, and my partners have done with it very effectively. No, thank you. They told us that we assert that politicians are perfect. We conceded very on in the debate, we don't think politicians are perfect. They told us that we said that people are dumb and aren't capable of voting. Well, let's go through what we have told them already and our new lines of refutation. First off, we told you that people don't fully understand the repercussions of their actions. We brought up the example of Iceland, where people brought their country into debt. Their only reply was, it's okay, people make mistakes. We're fine, people can make mistakes, but we don't think we should give them the opportunity to make mistakes that are going to cost their country for years and years to come. We don't think it's fair that they can make mistakes, not only for their generation, but for the next generation. We believe that if we can mitigate these mistakes, it's our responsibility to do so. Finally, we see that individuals are motivated by local interests. So while something might be good for an individual on the forefront, might seem to be good for them, it's oftentimes hard for an individual to understand the long term. We brought you the example of lawyers in Oliver's speech about how we don't allow individuals to go up and represent themselves, not because we think they're dumb or incapable, but because we recognize someone else is more specialized to do so. What we see here is that when a politician fails, we can get rid of them. When the public makes continuous mistakes, it gets to a point where we can only say mistakes are okay. It gets to a point where we have to agree that there's a better way and a better way to run the country. We believe, for all of the reasons we brought on side opposition, that we beg to oppose.
Okay, we will now call for the reply speaker in opposition.
We've heard a lot of interesting arguments from both sides of the House today. But on opposition, we see that this round has really been summed up into two main themes, which I'm going to go into my speech today and show you why on both side opposition has come out on top. The first theme I want to talk about is principally, how do we best uphold democracy? In this round, we talked a lot about two different types of bases for democracy. We talked about the voice of the people, and we talked about debate and discourse, and that was done on both sides. So about the voice of the people, what we told you on side opposition today is that hearing the voice of a minority in a in a controlled setting, in a parliamentary setting, is more beneficial than hearing the voice of a minority while they're trying to scream it across a nation without having any ability to do so. We didn't hear a response that was adequate to this from Side Proposition because they never told us how a minority could do this outside of it. They told us the problems with party politics, which were refuted by our third and second speaker, and by me as well. But they never actually told us how a minority could have their voice heard in a situation where there is no controlled setting to do so. Also, when we talked about party politics, we said that not only do they allow for debate and discourse, but they allowed for compromise to actually change a bill. They allowed for negotiations, like in a wording of a bill, to actually be changed instead of either passing it or scrapping it altogether. We didn't hear a response from this on Side Proposition today either. We didn't hear why being able to compromise on a bill, why being able to reform a bill that may have problems isn't beneficial. We told you about voter turnout and how because voter turnout is low, it's not an accurate representation of the people. We heard no response to this as well from Side Proposition. So we think that like this idea of the voice of the people falls on Side Proposition today. Then in terms of debating and discourse, we think that like we told you, referenda eliminates the ability to debate. And like principally, we think that like polls and referenda are very similar, which was conceded by Side Proposition. But what we told you is that referenda comes with many more like difficulties, many more practical difficulties that polls do not have, such as the regulation, such as the expertise by the people. So now I'd like to get into my second theme, that of practically. How do we help a nation for the long term? What we told you on Side Proposition was that we think that how we help a nation for the long term is by accountability, so that we can make long-term choices. We talked to you about like economic policy and foreign policy, and how if a government isn't able to like make promises with the country in the long term because it may not be able to pass a referenda, that they're not going to be able to do so. We think that without this ability and without these expertise, we're not going to be able to help a country in the long term, and we didn't hear any adequate response to this. We talked to you a lot about expertise and how people have the expertise, or don't have the expertise, sorry. And all we heard from Side Proposition was that they don't think politicians necessarily have the expertise either. But what we told you is that they're more qualified because it is their profession, because they need to represent the people, and because they can be voted out if they are misrepresenting the people, whereas you can't vote out society. And once again, this wasn't an idea that was addressed very far by Side Proposition. We told you that people wouldn't want to read 1,400 pages of Obamacare, and therefore wouldn't be educated if it was put through a referendum. This point was conceded when my honorable colleague asked what would happen if you wrote a 1,600-page document, and they told you, well, yeah, probably no one would want to read it. So if nobody wants to read these bills, we don't understand how, for example, like we're going to get the expertise needed for this. And then finally, we talked to you about we talked to you about examples such as that in Iceland and such as that in Switzerland, and how like for the long term, these weren't going to be beneficial, right? So we think that like because of all these reasons, because people aren't going to be held accountable, because there's no way to do so, because governments will no longer be able to make long-term promises, but not only can they not make long-term promises, but they're not able to have the power to reform bills. They're not able to have the power to negotiate even if a problem is found. We think that referenda are inherently harmful on a practical level and on a principle level. So we beg to oppose. Thank you.
Okay, to end the debate, we call reply to Speaker Extraordinaire, Team Government.
Side Opposition does not know what a referendum is. A referendum is a one-liner. It's not a 1,600-page financial bill. It's a one-liner. Should abortion be legal or not? It's as simple as that. So what we see is that their whole practicality point really falls here today on someone proposing this ridiculous 1,600-page bill. But let's really go into what the three main areas of clash were here today. Firstly, the effects on the political system. Secondly, representation. And thirdly, the alternative. So let's go into all three of them. And through this, we're going to see how Side Proposition really took the debate today. So let's go on the effects on the political system. Well, let's start with what Side Opposition said. Essentially what we say is that Side Opposition really lives in this black and white world. Even though they didn't admit to it, what they were trying to imply is that politicians, well, let's say they know more about a bill. Let's say they know more about an economy or society. and that they said citizens don't, that citizens are uneducated at times, that citizens aren't aware, that or voters aren't aware. And what we said to that were two things. Firstly, that is not the case, that there are awareness campaigns, that there can be debates, that there's no part in our model where it says there isn't any of this. And we also said that there are educated voters, that there are voters when they are concerned about what's happening in their country, and therefore they will make an educated vote. And what we see is that if they are so uneducated as side opposition painted them to be, then why are they even going to vote in the first place? Because if they're that uneducated, then why are they really concerned about what happens? But then let's talk about the second thing that they talked about. What we spoke about was majority and minority government. We presented a very clear problem in our current parliamentary democracy on how there's essentially a stalemate in majority governments and minority governments, and the only thing they said to that for majority governments was accountability. They said, well, they need to be concerned with the re-election. What we say is that that's not a good enough case to tell us that. Firstly, what we say to that is essentially then it still becomes a stalemate. Then the majority government is too afraid to do pass any bills or any resolutions because they're concerned with re-election. And a minority government, you don't have enough support from any of the parties to actually pass a resolution. So what we really see is that the problem still remains. Then we talked about social issues. So what about issues such as abortion, such as gay rights, issues that are often ignored by the systems and by the parties at the side opposition really had nothing to say to that. Instead, they ignored that throughout the debate. Then they also talked about essentially the nature of a referendum, that the very nature of a referendum is like there's no compromise. And they tried to tell us today how a central poll, why not just a poll? Well, what we say to that is, which one are we more inclined to do? Are we going to be inclined to answer a 1-800 number calling us and telling us what do we feel about something? Or are we going to be more inclined to vote? We feel that the inclination is the reason why we need referendums in the first place. Now let's talk about representation. Now they were concerned with the tyranny of majority. They brought forth examples where the majority supposedly exercised their majoritarian power. They talked about the minarets in Switzerland. However, this is already rebutted on our side of the house because we said, firstly, under our model, this would be against the Constitution. That when you're taking away someone's freedom of religion, it's going against the Constitution that's very clearly protected in the Constitution. And that was something that was very clearly emphasized in the model on side proposition today. But what we say, we take the stand to is even, for example, in Iceland, where their decision led to a downfall in their economy, what we say to that is that's the price that we on side proposition are willing to pay. Because at the end of the day, the debate here today was what is a democracy? And what we both agreed on today was that's ruled by the people. So essentially then the next question was, does a sovereign referenda have a place in a parliamentary democracy? And what we say to that was yes. Why? Because there's more representation by the people. Because in our current parliamentary democracy system, there is a lack of representation by the people, by the citizens, by the voters. And that was something that was never, ever addressed on side opposition's case. They had to prove to us today why sovereign referenda has no place in a parliamentary democracy. How our parliamentary democracies right now alone, currently, is what's upholding democratic values, and that's something that they failed to do because we provided to you many examples, many issues, social issues, majority-minority governments, a lack of representation by the true people, and what we say to them, they had nothing to say to that, and it's on those grounds that we on side proposition are proud to believe in this case. Thank you.
She thanks both teams. Would ask them to cross floor, shake hands, and give us some 5 minutes. Great job. Now, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for granting us this entertaining debate because we had fun judging it, and we're sure that our honored audience also had fun watching it. So, a round of applause for you guys. Sadly, there comes a point in a debater's life when a judge will tell him that he won or lost the debate. In every round, there's one debate there's one debate team that loses. Fear not, but that debate team is definitely one a lot of experience, and has won our thankful gratitude for providing us with the entertainment that we have had here. Now, on to the actual debate. It was a 3-0 decision. So that means all judges agreed on the winner. We believe that there was one team who kept on attacking. There was one team who kept on rebuilding substance. And there was one team who was a bit more cohesive in its streamlined in the way the speakers brought up the ideas in this debate. We believe it was the opposition. Now, I'll also touch on small comments. We would have wanted, we believe that Prop came up with a very good model. It was okay, completely okay that we had the Switzerland model. We had no problem whatsoever with it. We also thought that the ideas brought up by proposition were sustainable. The problem with them was that the impact failed to show as the debate went on to second and third speakers. So we would have wanted more impact and more analysis on the big problems that team proposition came up with, because we thought they were fine. On team opposition, we thought you guys did a pretty good job, but we would have liked a bit more analysis on why exactly there's no debate, there's no discourse if you have public referendum. Because it was a bit counterintuitive for us. Why exactly you'd have no debate if you'd still have lobbyists or parliamentarians or politicians talking about whether, for example, it's good to ban abortion or not. So these are the options. We commend you for your energy, and we definitely commend you for the analysis that you put and the work that you put into this, into researching this. And we would ask that you all come back for individual feedbacks. We have time now. We don't have dinner, so you know, we have all the time in the world.
But it might be better outside.
Yeah, but maybe outside on that lot, because we're melting. Cool. Congratulations again.
I'm gonna go to the main area. I'm gonna find the main. So I'll meet you guys and I'll meet you on the first day.
Romania.
I said we have a teacher from school, she's from Romania. My favorite's always she'll start talking. What? She'll smack you off. Knock it off. I've been in America long enough. My accent's not bad.
Especially when you're wearing a suit, it's worse.
Oh, I apologize. Yeah, what am I talking about?
Thank you for judging.
Thank you. Good debate.
Thank you.
has